The lecture that we're going to work on today, it's the one on March 31st, 1954, is a very difficult, very dense one. Last week, we were talking about the two narcissisms. Today, Lacan is building on that, but pushing a little bit further. The title of this class is The Ego Ideal and the Ideal Ego. Freud uses these expressions in German, the Ideal Ich and the Ich Ideal. So let me tell you from the start the difference between these two concepts in a nutshell, and then we go deeper. The ideal ego is an image. This is the easiest way of understanding this. The ideal ego, we should understand it in the register of the imaginary. Freud talks about this in the article on Narcissism when he's talking about how the baby needs to abandon at some point the primary narcissism, where he is the equivalent of perfection. He identifies with everything that is good. At some point, the reality principle starts to appear in the sense that starts noticing some of the good stuff in life is not always at hand. For example, mom's breast, and sometimes painful sensations also come from inside slowly, and this is a social process also. This idea of identifying with completion, perfection, total bliss needs to be abandoned. But primary narcissism, or in other words, the libido that attaches to one's own ego, does not disappear, but is displaced towards this ideal that we have in our psyche. So in our mind, we still have the image of a perfect self, of a perfect me. And this is the ideal ego, an image. Later in life, for example, maybe I'm not doing that well at school, or my friends are not choosing me. I feel they are choosing other people, but I still have this ideal of if I just were better at playing football, or if I were cooler, or if I were just like my pop idol, or like my dad, or if I were stronger, I have this ideal image of myself. And my narcissistic libido is attached to this ideal image. So this is the ideal ego, an image. At some point, Freud, in the article on narcissism, without a warning, it's not that he introduces the concept formally. He just happens to start saying ego ideal rather than ideal ego. And there's even controversy about whether this is something that he does like intentionally or wasn't careful about the wording. Lacan thinks this is intentional, and that the ego ideal is different from the ideal ego. The ego ideal is more related to the symbolic, not to the imaginary. So the ego ideal is, for example, related to things that you hear from your parents, from society, about how you should be in order to reach this ideal. So this is more like a voice. It's more symbolic. It's like when you remember the things that your dad used to tell you about what you should do in order to succeed in life or to be a better person, the way to do things, or like the moral advice, all this internalized voice of all the things we have heard and received from culture, from our parents. So it's similar to the ideal ego. It can be confused to this image about this greatness, but the displacement is that now we are approaching it from the symbolic register, more as a norm, as a law, as an internalized voice about who you should become. At this point, 1914, when Freud publishes the article on narcissism, he still had not developed the concept of the superego. So the ego ideal is a precursor of this. It's like the first formulation that Freud does, like approaching this idea of the superego. The first part of the lecture is this presentation by one of Lacan's students, Leclerc. He is going slowly with Freud's text on narcissism, paragraph by paragraph, and Lacan is reacting to that. And at the end of the lecture, Lacan intervenes more decisively and adds a lot of interesting and very surprising conceptualizations. This is an example that I was giving you the other day to illustrate something that Freud says in the article on narcissism, and that is that when you are sick or when you are in real pain, it's like the world shrinks. Lacan gives an example of a comic cartoon in which a poet has a toothache. And so he says all his Platonic dreamings about the world of ideas, all his philosophy, all his spiritual love, and also his interest in the world, the stock prices, paying taxes, the multiplication table, everything disappears, fades away. Nothing interests us anymore because all we care about is our toothache. This is an example of what happens to the libido. When we feel strong and healthy, our libido goes into the world. We work, we love, we transform things. We are invested in the world. When we have a toothache, we withdraw all this libido from the world and we only care about ourselves. Maybe it's an evolutionary trait. You need to repair yourself. You need to survive before you are able to go back again into the world. The point is that for Freud, the libido is this fixed amount, this fixed quantity of energy, of sexual energy, that is movable, that it can flow out to objects, to object relations, but it can also flow back into the ego. So it can become object libido, and it can again become narcissistic libido. If someone can accuse me when I'm having my toothache and tell me, you're being selfish, you only care about yourself. And I would reply, yes, at this moment, I only care about myself because my tooth aches. Corresponding to these two kinds of libido, the object libido and the narcissistic libido, Freud says that we also have two kinds of love, that there is narcissistic love in which you love basically who you are or what you wear or what you would like to be. Or you can love someone, but because you see this person as part of yourself. So you're loving in a mirror. And the second one in German is Alleinungstypus, the Alleinung type. This is translated in the English as anaclitic love. But basically it's the love that is supported by an external object. You love an external object. And Freud says the child that is narcissistic from the beginning, when he starts loving, for example, the person who takes care of him or who feeds him or who protects him, this is the first kind of anaclitic love. In Freud, you can have a neat distinction between these two kinds of love, between object relations and narcissistic love. And in Lacan, if you pay attention to everything that he's saying in this class, it's like every time we're in love, there's a strong narcissistic component. We're never free of this narcissistic component of love for Lacan. What does the child love in the mother? It's not the milk itself. It's not really the breast as an object. It's the image, it's the figure attached to the image of the mother and the sensations related to being fed and being held. So both narcissistic love and anaclitic love, loving an external, a separate object, run on images. There's no pure, grown-up, realistic love waiting, like a healthy love waiting at the end of the road. So Lacan will make fun of this version of mature love. And he actually calls this the myth of psychoanalysis. We're talking about Lacan's seminar, but in this seminar, Leclerc is discussing Freud's article on narcissism, and Lacan is intervening. They get to this point where they are discussing the ideal ego. And they are commenting on how Freud considers the ideal ego as this ideal image that we build inside ourselves when we are overcoming primary narcissism, when we are abandoning actually primary narcissism. We're losing this perfect image of our own ego, but we still preserve some ideal of what we should be. Again, this can be exemplified by figures we admire. It can be the mother, the father, an older sibling, maybe a pop singer, some kind of idol. But Leclerc, Lacan, and also other participants in the seminar pay attention that at some point in the article on narcissism, Freud, who was using the expression ideal ego, suddenly, without warning, starts using the expression ego ideal, right? And we don't know if this is a mistake. Are the two terms equivalent for Freud? Lacan thinks this is not an error. He thinks this is intentional, and that the shift from the ideal ego to the ego ideal happens when Freud is saying that inside us there is something that watches, something that measures the actual ego against the ideal all the time, something that keeps the books. So this watcher, this agency, Freud says, we cannot exactly find it. We can only suppose it is there. Where do we see it most clearly, this watcher? In psychosis. In the patient who complains, you remember I'm giving the same example every day, every lecture, but I think it's useful, about my client who had discovered a chemical formula to solve the world energy crisis. And he complains that the CIA is following him and the Russians are trying to steal his secret. Some psychotics complain that other people can read their thoughts. And Freud here makes a very interesting comment. He says, the psychotic is right. They are right. There is such a power watching over us. There is a power that watches and judges all our intentions. And it exists in all of us, only that the psychotic hears it like loudly, right? As a real voice. For us, these are our thoughts. We're doing something and we are thinking, this is wrong, what I'm doing. Or I'm being a jerk. Or I'm being so stupid. This is shameful. My dad, if he were alive, he would be ashamed of me. Later in his work, like 9 years later, Freud will call this the superego. But in 1914, when he writes on narcissism, he still hadn't coined this concept. The important thing, again, about this ego ideal is that different from the ideal ego, the ego ideal is not an image. It's speaking to us. It's commenting on our actions. It's judging. Lacan says it's a symbolic agency, an agency that speaks. So let's keep this in mind, the difference between the image, right, the imaginary, and something that is speaking internally in us, that is watching and judging, image and voice. At some point, Leclerc reads a sentence from Freud saying that the development of the ego is a movement away from primary narcissism, and then a vigorous attempt to get that lost state back, to recover that initial, beautiful, perfect state. So primary narcissism is this mythical moment where the baby felt complete, perfect in itself. That has to be abandoned in development as libido is redirected toward external objects. But what we were saying is the subject tries to recover this ideal state by forming an image of the ideal ego and by chasing this ideal throughout his life. So we start whole, we lose this, and we set up an ideal that we receive mostly from the outside world. And we spend our lives trying to climb back up to that ideal. Now, when they're discussing this creates some kind of confusion in Leclerc's presentation about whether this image of the ego, is it just a better looking version of me? Is it something else? Then one of the students that is there, Manoni, and we have all the interventions of, like in this class, Leclerc speaks, Hippolyte speaks, Manoni speaks, and Manoni says we should distinguish the development of the person from the structuration of the ego. And Lacan takes this, jumps on it, and says, yes, structuration of the ego. This is exactly where the analysis happens. It happens in this intersection, the joint between the imaginary and the symbolic. So what he's saying is we need to separate this image, this ideal ego, this perfect image of ourselves, of the symbolic process of structuration, the structuring of the subject. And to explain this, he goes back to the apparatus again, the optical experiment. Right? So this was our first, most simple version. And we will go again through the different versions of the optical apparatus. This first version can be used to explain even the imaginary in animals. So you remember the stickleback, right? This was this fish that he takes as an example. When there is time for them to mate, the male changes the skin color around his belly and does a kind of zigzag dance around the female, and the female responds automatically. So there is a courtship dance, but Lacan says, what is putting this machine in action? What is setting this off? Not a thought, not a concept, but an image. He uses also the German word, a gestalt, a form. And he says, this is strange language too, the male is completely identified with the image that triggers the dance. Completely identified, I think it means it's not that he can make a distinction between this is how I see it, and then I'm going to reason about this image. The image triggers automatically his response. And we were saying also last week that we can trick the fish. We can show it a cardboard cutout, badly made, but with the right markings in the fish belly, and we place this in a certain form near the female, and the sexual behavior fires. So the lure works. And scientists use lures in experiments because animals can react to these images. So this is not the real partner, it's an image, it's a trick, but this animal sexuality to some extent seems to run on the imaginary, on images, and it can be displaced. So we can use a fake version of the fish and still trigger the sexual behavior. Why are we illustrating this behavior of the fish with this version of the experiment? Because what we are seeing here is, remember, the flowers hidden in the box here are the real flowers. The vase on top is also real, but the flowers on top of the vase are not there, but they are a real image. And by real image, what we mean is that if we are in the right position, that the eye is on the upper left, if we are in the right position at the center of this cone of light, the right position in relation to the objects and to the curved mirror, we see the flowers as if they were in the vase. This is the trick. So the real and the imaginary are together and are indistinguishable for the fish, at least. So the fish, what is he interacting with? Reality, but also images. They are not distinguished like two layers. They are just one layer. There is a juxtaposition of the real and the imaginary. So here, the vase is real. The flowers are a real image, are an image placed in our 3D space. The real flowers cannot be seen directly, only through their reflection. Now, Lacan says, okay, this happens to the fish. What happens with human beings? And I want to read you this quote from the seminar. He says, in man, as we know, an eminent disorder characterizes the manifestations of the sexual function. Nothing in it adapts. So nothing in the human being adapts. In the animal, the image and the object fit. Unless there is some scientist like playing with the fish, there is complete adaptation. The belly of the male changes color, and this triggers the behavior in the female. And there are no doubts about what each individual has to do. The whole sexual behavior is triggered automatically. So there is perfect correspondence between the individual and the environment, the Umwelt, we were saying last week. But in human beings, Lacan says, the image and the object, they don't fit. Human sexuality is a mess. The image and the normal object, he says, they play hide and seek. Nothing clicks into place. And you know this because of your clinical practice. I love him, but he doesn't love me back, or all kinds of perversions, fetishisms, fantasies, searching for a satisfaction that is always partial, that is always displaced. So Lacan is attacking the story that analysts tell themselves, especially neo-Freudians. The story Lacan is attacking is something like the patient will grow in analysis, will mature, will identify with a healthy analyst, and will reach genital love, and will be finally adapted to reality, and will be mentally and sexually healthy. And Lacan calls this the promised land, El Dorado, he says. El Dorado is what the first conquerors and explorers expected to find when they arrived to South America, like a country made of gold, so that they could steal everything. But this is not what we should promise our patients, right? This idea of emotional maturity and full genital sexuality is some kind of cultural standard that we are imposing on them. Lacan is saying, don't assume that this happy ending is the natural thing. We're not lucky like the fish are. This is not handed to us by biology. Nothing in human sexuality simply adapts on its own. So if nothing adapts on its own, what makes the human image hold together at all, what is it? And this is the question that the optical machine has to answer, right? what makes the human image the image of what we desire hold together. He will add one more detail to the optical apparatus. What you're seeing in the screen now is what we added last week. This is the flat mirror. So the thing here is you are represented by this eye in the upper left. And although the flowers are near you, the real flowers, let's say your drives, your instincts, your conscious, you don't see it directly. You see this through the reflection of a flat mirror, a plane mirror that is here. And the advantage of having a plane mirror is that then you will not be able to distinguish at all what is real and what is imaginary between the flowers here and the vase here, because everything is reflected on the curved mirror. The image is unified here, right? So if you follow this line here, the vase is reflected in the curved mirror and appears here, but you're seeing everything on the flat mirror. So you will see the vase, the flowers, and yourself as three entities inhabiting the same space. Now, he's also adding these virtual images on this right side. This represents what you are seeing on the other side of the plane mirror. And you see this unity. And you could also draw a face maybe here because you're also seeing your own face. So the paradox is this. The flowers are near you. This is the closest thing to yourself. Still, you cannot see it directly. You see it through the mediation of the other. And this is what the plane mirror represents, the mediation of the other. So we don't see ourselves directly. We don't see our own flowers, drives, our own vase, our own body directly. We see everything through the mediation of the other, the plane mirror. We will only see this unity. I will see myself as complete and whole if I am in the right position. And also Lacan adds, if the plane mirror is at the right angle. If you change your position or you change the inclination of the mirror, the image decomposes. It goes blurry, it breaks up, it vanishes. We can put a face here, right? Because where I'm putting my mouse here is where the eye will see himself or herself. So this is a virtual subject, a subject on the other side of the plane mirror. Let me read it from Lacan. The virtual subject, reflection of the mythical I, that is to say, the other which we are, is there we first saw our ego, outside us in the human form. So this is, he's referring, of course, to the mirror stage. But now we understand, if the flat mirror is the other, we understand that this is not a technical trick, that we place a mirror in front of a 1-year-old and the 1-year-old just recognizes himself and constitutes his own ego. Because the mirror is actually a metaphor for the function of the other. So you need to have like a mom, a dad, a grandma, an uncle, a friend, someone who is reflecting back to you who you are, who is telling you you're beautiful, or you're stupid, or you're smart, wonderful. And so, again, this is where the virtual subject emerges. And this is where we first see our own ego, as from this external point of view. The place where I first found myself was not inside me. It was out there, in a form, in a human shape outside myself. So this is how the baby sees herself as a whole in the mirror, before she can actually coordinate her own body. But what we are seeing now is that this anticipation can only be supported by the other. Lacan says there, the human being only sees his form, materialized, whole, the mirage of himself outside of himself. Okay, if we're doing psychoanalysis, especially the first sessions, you need to provide some sense of consistency, be a mirror a little bit for the client. You cannot just ask a person to start free associating and confront their anxiety like in the first session. So first of all, you need to be stable, you need to reflect back on them and create this environment of calm and safety and empathy, but not to stay there forever, right? Just to create this first imaginary reflection, this first flat mirror, but then to start working on the symbolic. The flat mirror represents the other. Let me read this from Lacan. I think now it makes much more sense. The inclination of the plane mirror is governed by the voice of the other. This doesn't happen at the level of the mirror stage, but it happens subsequently through our overall relation with others, the symbolic relation. So this can be, we can connect this with the two narcissisms. First narcissism can be explained with a concave mirror, just with this, the left part of this diagram, right? Just the unification of the body, the real image of the base. But now, secondary narcissism involves the plane mirror, where you're receiving all these messages from the other. So this doesn't happen at the mirror stage, says Lacan, but happens subsequently. You are with other people who reflect back on you and define who you are. And here he's talking about the voice of the other. He says the inclination. So the mirror, the flat mirror, is a metaphor for the imaginary. But he says that the inclination, like at what angle the mirror is reflecting at you. We use this expression, right, to look at things from a certain angle. And this is determined not by the image, but by the voice of the other. The tilt of my self-image is set by words, by my place among other people, by the symbolic relations. So he says, for example, in this lecture, he's very simple examples. He talking to Manoni and he says, you are Manoni, I am Jacques Lacan. We stand in a certain relation right now because we are in my lecture, but it will be a different relation if we were together in a police station or if we were together traveling in a train. So because in different contexts, there are different rules of exchange, there are different laws, and these laws and the language, the symbolic word in general, mediate. They are the go-between. So they mediate between subjects. So going back, the ideal ego, ideal ich, is the image. This whole flattering picture of myself I see in the good mirror. The ego ideal, ich ideal, is the voice, the other as speaking, the symbolic point from which I am seen, and I am placed. And it is the ego ideal, the voice, that governs the tilt of the flat mirror. The voice decides whether the image comes out whole or broken. Then he gives another example. He says, for example, imagine that I'm just looking through the window in my living room at dusk. And so my lights are on, so I can see the outside world. I can see the street outside the window, but I also see myself reflected in the mirror. And this is, he says, a very good metaphor of what we do the whole day. We are all the time like juxtaposing the imaginary and the real in this way. Let me read another complicated paragraph, but I think it will make much more sense now. This is nothing other than the images of the human body and the hominization of the world, its perception in terms of images linked to the structuration of the body. Let me give you an example that I can swear is from 1 hour ago. My 6-year-old daughter gave me a beautiful example. I turned on the AC and she said, when you turn the dot on, it sticks out its tongue and it starts blowing air. So she described it as a human, the air conditioning, right? Opening up the mouth and sticking the tongue and starts blowing air. Because it has this thing, I don't know how you call it, when it opens like this. Okay, these flat things, I don't know how they're called. So Lacan is saying there is nothing other than the images of the human body and the hominization of the world, its perception in terms of images linked to the structuration of the body. The real objects, which pass via the mirror and through it, are in the same place as the imaginary object. The essence of the image is to be invested by libido. What we call libidinal investment is what makes an object become desirable. So first, the world we live in is humanized. We could say anthropomorphized. This is the example of my daughter. And the easiest example also is the legs of the table, right? This kind of very basic everyday metaphors we use. The world is shaped by the image of our own body. We don't live in a neutral world of like neutral physics. We live in a world cut up by the body. And there, Lacan says, we refer to an oral, anal, and genital reality. And again, in my daughter's example, she was using oral images. She was talking about mouth and tongue and blowing. And the other very important element is that Lacan is saying that the essence of the image is to be invested by libido. And this is how we are different from the fish. This is how we are different from animals. The object becomes desirable when it gets confused with one of these images we carry around inside us. It is like the fish, because the fish also has this image that carries around. But in our case, the desire is not biological need. There are 3 quotes that I wanted to include. One is when he says, "What is my desire? What is my position in the imaginary structuration? This position is only conceivable insofar as one finds a guide beyond the imaginary, on the level of the symbolic plane, on the legal exchange which can only be embodied in the verbal exchange between human beings. The guide governing the subject is the ego ideal." So we have an image that can activate our desire, but that image does not support itself. It is supported by the symbolic exchange between people, the laws, the language, and the ego ideal. The ego ideal, you see, goes to the symbolic. The ideal ego is sustained in the last resort by the ego ideal, by the symbolic. Then he talks at the end of the lecture about love, and he says, and this is a little bit, I think, against Freud, against this clear-cut distinction between narcissistic love and analytic or object-oriented love. Lacan says, love is a phenomenon which takes place on the imaginary level and which provokes a veritable subduction of the symbolic, a sort of annihilation, of perturbation of the function of the ego ideal. Very strange language. Subduction, I had to Google it, is something from geology. When you have like plates and one goes under the other. You know, there's like a movement in the plates and one goes under the other. The one that goes under, this is a subduction. So he's saying that when we are, quote unquote, in our normal state, we use our ego ideal. He later would say we use our superego. We govern ourselves by the symbolic order. But when we fall in love, everything is disrupted. So there is this subduction of the symbolic. The symbolic is annihilated because the only thing we care about is the image of the beloved. This is the only thing we care about. The ego ideal, the symbolic, collapses. He later says it's one's own ego that one loves in love. This is, again, I think it is against Freud. Even though he follows Freud almost in everything, I think in this he's trying to go beyond Freud, saying we cannot keep this neat distinction between the healthy love of object relations and the narcissistic love. It is always one's own ego that one loves in love, one's own ego made real on the imaginary level. We can think with the optical apparatus. When we are in love, we look beautiful in this mirror. This is what we care about. We see this in our practice also. When she looks at me, I finally feel real. Or if he stops desiring me, I will disappear. So the ego is hanging from the other's image of it. And he ends up talking about transference love and saying this is a riddle, transference love, because love is very hard to find in real life. To find that specific person that will fit your image, that will really turn on your desire. This doesn't happen every day. But in the analytic situation, it's instantly. You enter first session, you enter the office of the analyst, and transference is already there. Even love, transference love. So this is a mystery, and he will talk about how does it happen in the next lecture. How is it possible that this is so reliable, so uniform, that unless the analyst really screws up just by keeping like a couple of variables in order, transference love gets started.